Okay, so hello everybody, thank you for joining us. So thanks for joining Humanist Exchange. If you're joining us again, I hope, but if this is your first try, thanks for joining us for this nice event tonight, on this cold night. So today we're going to be talking about free speech versus hate speech, and where do we draw the line? This is a topic that needs very little introduction. As we know, this freedom of speech is a cornerstone of any democracy. But the question that we want to answer is, does this mean we can say anything? Where should censorship come in? We want to try and tackle these topics through an exchange rather than head-to-head debate. We want to try and have a discussion where we can talk about the facts and what we need to do, especially in the local context and especially in the context of humanists in Malta. Now, today we have two very accomplished speakers with us here to join us on these interesting topics. To start off first with Emma Portelli Bonnici, who's joining us here. Thank you for joining us, who graduated in law in 2017. During her time at university, she was very active in student organizations, being general secretary and then president of We Are, also being social coordinator of KSU, which is the biggest student organization at university. She's also managed TEDx University of Malta for the past 6 years. And this year, she graduated or is graduating with a master's in international maritime law. She's worked on many topics, from civil liberties to sexual and reproduction rights, among many topics in Malta, and is now a candidate in the general election on the PN ticket. So thank you for joining us. Joining us as well, we also have Michael Briguglio, who's a sociologist, a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Malta, also with many interests ranging from social movement, politics, protest, civil society, environment, social policy. Sorry, it came out twice. And he's also a board member of Research Network 24, social movements of Research Network 24, and is a founding member of the Malta Sociological Association. He's also an op-ed columnist at the Malta Independent. So thank you for joining us as well. So feel free to unmute.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so like normal, we're going to go through a few questions and try and see our opinions, and our topics, and these sorts of things. I urge all the audience members to follow us on Facebook, follow our page, our group, and also to comment. So at the end of this, we'll go through some of the points and comments that you put on Facebook. So to kick it off, so maybe Emma, if you'd like to start. So in your opinion, so what does free speech mean to you? And where can we draw the line or the distinction with free speech and hate speech?
Okay, so freedom of speech is the freedom to express oneself, and this is enshrined in our constitution. So not to be too legalistic, our constitution is the primal law of the land. It's mostly unsupersedable by anything else. It's all held within Article 41, where it goes into freedom of expression, and obviously there are also other human rights listed close by. Freedom of expression is another right that is recognized across the board in most international documents pertaining to human rights law. And Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights clearly states that this right comes with special duties and responsibilities. So we know that rights are not inalienable, and they're not definitive. There are limitations to each of them. So Article 41, where we talk about it domestically, the restrictions to this right are included therein, and these are often cited in the context in Malta. So these are like the respect for the rights and reputations of others. So you come into libel and defamation, the protection of national security or public order, which is what is often cited when it comes to freedom of information and all of these things, public health and public morals. So it doesn't mean that the government can just say, no, we can't do this. And it also doesn't mean that a government can just say that when something pertains to either sex or religion, you know, those topics that we're not allowed to talk about, it cannot be said. So that comes into censorship. So I think to answer the question in summation, really, because it's quite a loaded question, what freedom of speech means to me personally is pretty irrelevant. Freedom of speech is protected, and it's less subjective than online social media threads would have us believe. The right isn't curtailed when someone disagrees with you. It's not curtailed when someone tells you very rudely to shut up in a comment thread on Facebook. I mean, we could all do with learning how to have a real discussion, but it's not that. It is, however, curtailed by the institutionalized and deeply embedded culture of impunity that, for example, was created by the state, which led to the murder of one of our foremost journalists. So there are things that do curtail it, and there are things that do not. Learning that would be a pretty good step in the right direction, in my view.
Michael, from your side, where do you see the bridge or the distinction coming? Freedom of speech versus hate speech?
Okay. First of all, thank you for this invitation. Well, I think freedom of speech is something contextual. It depends on which society we are speaking about. It depends on when, where, by whom. For example, freedom of speech in Malta is different than freedom of speech in Russia. If you can say that Russia has freedom of speech, but probably in its constitution there would be laws which regulate speech. In every jurisdiction, you will find laws which, in one way or another, regulate how we can communicate, and how we can speak. So, freedom of speech is not something universal. It is something which is contextualized, and even when laws are similar, it's the way how a law is applied at the end of the day. There's the political dimension to a law. And freedom of speech is relational. You cannot look at freedom of speech in a vacuum. If I say something and I offend you, my freedom of speech has an impact on you. And now, how can we relate this to hate speech? Well, what hate speech is exactly isn't something on which there is universal agreement. For example, within the EU right now, there's a big debate on hate speech, on what should be enshrined in law and what should not. I think that very often, even referring to the public sphere in Malta, I think we're quite selective on what hate speech is. Let me give you an example. If we offend someone because of race, which to me is unacceptable, I am anti-racist and so forth, we make a lot of noise. But if we offend someone because he happens to be a Labourite or a nationalist, and this has been done by a lot, even by some journalists, saying that someone has a lower IQ because he is red or blue, for example, that's hate speech in my opinion too. Hate speech isn't simply telling someone to shut up or telling someone saying something racist or sexist or homophobic, which are all condemnable in my opinion. But hate speech goes beyond that. And in my opinion, we have to broaden that further. We have to look at fake speech as well, which to me is as worrying as hate speech. On the social media, there's a free-for-all. Everyone can say what he or she likes. Everyone is judge and jury on all issues which we can speak about. So maybe you wouldn't be offending someone directly, like telling him to shut up or calling someone something or whatever. But if you say something where you dehumanize somebody else because you invent a story on him, or you make a caricature of a person, and sometimes, unfortunately, this is done even by some so-called journalists. To me, that is as bad as hate speech. So when we speak of freedom of speech, in my opinion, we have to relate freedom with responsibility. You cannot look at one without the other. Personally, I am very liberal. I believe in liberal values. I believe in freedom, but you cannot have freedom without responsibility. If I am free to tell you whatever I want, then I also have to take responsibility. If I say something about you and it happens not to be true, for example, or it happens to spoil your job prospects, for example, or people start looking down upon you, and we have a lot of instances of this in Malta. People who face trial by media, for example, people who are processed in court. I believe in rule of law, so I believe that the court should decide on various aspects, not the media or some opinionist or myself. If there is something which is being decided in a legal way, it is the judge who should decide. And to me, in a context of freedom of speech, it is unacceptable that on various topics, and I'm referring to people from different stripes and colors, okay, from different backgrounds. It's unacceptable that in the name of freedom of speech, we rush to conclusions before allowing a judicial process take its course. So freedom of speech isn't only about what I have the right to say and so forth, which is sacred to me, but it's also about the responsibility which comes with your freedom. Freedom isn't an absolute. Freedom isn't something in isolation. Freedom is relational to responsibility, and freedom is always contextual. Okay, so the fact that we are actually discussing it here, for example, is very different from, you know, if we were in Russia, where some people actually are in prison just for speaking for freedom of speech. So we have to contextualize. Yeah. And that is very important, because when we contextualize, it means that a topic is politicized. Now, by politicized, I'm not referring to Labour or PN or whatever, but politicized meaning that there are various interests, various groups, conflicts of interest sometimes. Not in a context of freedom of speech, not everyone is equal. If you want to say something and you have a whole media empire behind you, for example, it's different than if you want to say something and you have no access to the media. So freedom of speech is contextual. It's not simply a concept. Freedom of speech is something social and political.
Maybe to bring in Emma again. So we've mentioned the courts. So how do you see this balance between courts, civil society, or the NGOs, organizations? How do you see this playing out and in the local context? You have to unmute.
Unmute.
Can I just switch back to something Michael said?
Yes.
So can I just ask, Michael, so you think that hate speech is wider than we usually discuss? Do you think that the laws should change to include these wider angles, perhaps? But would that not also then go into censorship issues?
First of all, I don't think that everything can be solved by law. Certain things are cultural, political, and educational. For example, everyone has the freedom to say whatever he likes on Facebook, which is fine. I have no problem with that. I mean, I got offended many times on Facebook, and I mean, and so I know what it means, and I had people saying lies about me on blogs but that's part of the game, you know. So, but I don't believe that we are equipped. I don't believe. Sorry.
It really shouldn't be part of the game. We've come to accept it as part of the game, and that's another part of the problem.
But the problem for me is that we are very selective on when to say that when to decide that something is hate speech or not. If something is bad, it's bad, whether the best blogger in the world says it and whether the most corrupt politician says it. If you are dehumanizing someone, you could be the best journalist in the world, you are still dehumanizing someone. And I say that as a problem. In Malta, for example, some of our press is very ethical and is slower than other media and publishes stories after they verify. And we have some other sections of the press which splash names all around, they misquote people and they act as clickbait. Now both are free. So my going back to your question, which is extremely important on the legal part, I believe that we need to equip ourselves in a way where, for example, a reader can verify whether a journalist is really a journalist or a self-appointed whatever. I reckon in this country, everyone is a journalist. Everyone is a sociologist, everyone is an economist, everyone is a psychologist, everyone is a COVID expert, everyone is an expert on everything. When it rains, everyone is a weather expert on Facebook. So what am I saying? We need to invest more, and this is something which even the European Parliament has been saying for quite some time, where a 70-year-old who is reading the news, and these are things which happen, and wants to check about COVID, for example, this 70-year-old would be equipped to realize that there is a difference between something which is published by the World Health Organization, which is slower because there's peer review, there's verification, there's the scientific process, there's due diligence, blah, 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 than having some blogger or I have nothing against bloggers, but on Facebook, we have people who say that they are bloggers or podcasters or whatever, or influencers. Let's use the word influencer, who suddenly invents a conspiracy theory on COVID and starts getting a lot of likes and whatever. I mean, we all remember Donald Trump speaking about taking Dettol, or I don't know what he said one should take for COVID, and
a number of things. But this is the point. So
yes.
In your opinion, do you see this, should this be coming from the courts, from the politicians, from the law, or should this be something from civil society? Should we be pushing for more transparency from civil society?
And also, can I just second question, because now I'm interested in the discussion as well. I recently led the Ataktar group, where we came up with a lot of proposals for, it was a party-based initiative, but it was proposals on the back of the public inquiry report about Daphne Caruana Galizia. In that, we actually tried to define who is a journalist. And that definition in itself, making that definition or regulating the profession in any way, makes it more susceptible to interference and removal of impartiality.
Aren't doctors regulated?
Yes, I mean, so are lawyers, so are architects.
If you have a backache, would you want to go to someone who is certified as a doctor or to someone who isn't?
I understand your point, but who's a journalist? What is the criteria?
At the University of Malta, you can study to be a journalist. And when you are a journalist, you learn things like ethics, for example, which some journalists in Malta follow, and they follow such ethical procedures very well. They don't rush to conclusions. And some other self-appointed journalists who are not even qualified as journalists sometimes publish news which are false. They ruin somebody's life.
I understand
that is not on, in my opinion. No, I'm not in favor of censorship. But if I ruin your life because I happen not to like you and I start calling you names, and I should have some responsibility for this. The least that we can do.
I agree entirely.
The least that we can do is to make a distinction between who is a journalist and who is not. I'm not saying we should curtail freedom of speech, but if I want news, if I want to read news about something, I would want to read it from someone who has done the research, not someone who has woken up in the morning with a bad mood. No, we don't have that in Malta, because in Malta, if you declare that you are a journalist, suddenly you are a journalist. And this counts for other professions as well. In some professions, you are warranted. For example, you are a lawyer, so in psychology, you are a warranted psychologist. If you are a teacher, but in other professions, not only in journalism, even in other professions, you hear people declaring themselves that they are economists, for example, and they are not economists. Now, in the realm of free speech, I find this to be very dangerous, because journalists have a lot of responsibility towards society.
I get what you're saying, but for example, what you said exactly about COVID, that perfect example, I'm not a doctor, but if I start harping on about conspiracy theories online, everyone knows I'm not a doctor. I make it no secret. I'm not in any medical registry. So people still don't do that. That's, there's still a gap. And I think going on to define journalists and what makes a journalist becomes dangerous territory. Because even what you're saying, okay, you graduate, you do ethics. So many lawyers and so many of our politicians graduated and did ethics.
Yes, but
you know, as in,
As
it
in-
doesn't
first of all,
necessarily
in
mean that
Malta,
you will be
politics isn't a
ethical.
profession.
No,
Politics
but
isn't
so
a
many
profession.
of
We
them
a
have
part-time
warranted.
parliament.
So
Malta-
many of them have warranted professions.
Yes, but with the warrant comes responsibility. So if I am a journalist and tomorrow I publish a story about you which is totally untrue, for example, or I make allegations, and because of these allegations suddenly everyone decides that these are a fact, I have to take responsibility for it. Whoever I am, wherever I come from. I'm not interested in colors or whatever.
I agree.
But
I agree.
No, I know it's very difficult to draw a line. It is very difficult because I'm against censorship, but I'm also in favor of responsibility. For example, as a scholar, and Jackson here would probably agree, when we publish something, there's a peer review process. So I publish something, I think that what I published is correct, and I would have spent 2 years of research. Then I send it to a journal, and the journal tells me this is not correct, this has to change. So I am double checked by other scholars in the field. Now, what I am saying is that given that journalism is such an important profession, and I am all for freedom of the press and so forth, okay, there have to be responsibilities. If I as an academic do not follow ethical procedures when I publish, my paper will be disqualified, for example. Now, there are journalists and there are self-appointed journalists, and I would realize when a journalist does his homework, but when sometimes you have articles, and this is not only a Maltese problem, and this is a problem all around the world. I mean, sometimes you have.
But what form would you take this? What form are you proposing that this would take in the local context? Are you imagining, I don't know, are you imagining some sort of transparency, some information referencing?
No, first of all, I'm expecting that, like other professions, journalists there should be a register or something up there. It doesn't mean it should be restrictive. I mean, it should be as open as possible. But, you know, sometimes you read
exactly coming back to it. That's exactly it. So, okay, not everyone can become a journalist, you said. Maybe you go to uni and that's what qualifies you. So it is restrictive. So how do you draw the box that journalists
How do you draw a box
into?
as to who is a lawyer?
Differently. You need a law degree, but
yes,
there are not
why
all
not for journalism
when
journalism is such an important
journalism
profession?
I think I'm agreeing that it's an important profession, and I'm agreeing that it's such an important point of our democracy as well, but to regulate it by ensuring that they have a warrant, I believe, is a very dangerous path personally.
No, it depends. That's why things are contextual. Let me give you an example. In Malta, civil society is regulated, okay? And in Russia, civil society is regulated. Now, in Russia, civil society is regulated in a way where if you don't conform to what Putin says, you are officially labeled a foreign agent. So many NGOs have basically closed shop in Russia. In Malta, there are a lot of defects in our legislation on NGOs. And last year, when government wanted to introduce some restrictions, which according to many voluntary organizations were not on, they changed. Now I'm not giving merit to government or to the NGO. It's a different context. So in Malta, you still have VOs which are regularized, but the context is different because we live in a democracy with all its limitations, and you mentioned the inquiry and so forth. Fair enough. But you have to contextualize. There has to be some form of regulation on all professions. Regulation doesn't mean censorship. Journalism doesn't mean free speech. Free speech is there for everyone. You can say whatever you like on Facebook. But as a reader, I have the right to know if what you are saying is being funded by a big business. We have had journalists, and I'm not going to mention names, but I mean, I don't want to I don't want to be controversial, but we've had journalists in the past who were writing opinion columns, ta parsi, neutral, But then we got to know that they were being funded by some big business. Don't I have the right to know that as a reader? So don't I have the right to know that a journalist is warranted as a journalist, and it's not someone who woke up in the morning and said whatever he likes? He can say whatever he likes, but I have the right to know if he is a journalist or not. That is why there are these words: journalist, blogger, activist, VO member, lawyer, sociologist. Mind you, this is a problem for many professions and not only journalism.
I get what you're saying, and I think in principle we're in agreement a lot. It's just about like how we would go about it differently.
Yes.
I do agree that there need to be more stringent rules. For example, especially when it comes to COVID, this became so clear. Like the amount of completely unbacked, completely fallacious, unscientific things I was reading online. But I also feel as though regulating the profession would be problematic. And we do have rights that sort of allow us to fight back when something is said by someone in a malicious way, for example,
Yeah, like
libel,
I say something about you,
defamation.
for example. You take me to court and 5 years later, the court decides. And then those 5 years, my
Exactly.
life would be ruined.
Exactly. So perhaps we need faster court systems, a
Definitely.
more efficient judiciary.
We agree.
You know, I totally agree on that.
By
that's
regulation, I'm
something
not
I think-
saying regulation doesn't mean that I believe that, you know, there should be some strong arm of the law, but there should be some form of standard or something. And one of them is that our libel laws, in my opinion, they don't work equally with everyone. And how come some libels take 2 years to be heard and others take a few months, for example? I find, I'm not a court expert, but this is very problematic. And many of us have had court issues, and sometimes a court issue takes a century and another court issue takes a week,
yes.
for example. So these, by regulation, this is what I mean. We need to standardize things, and not only in the public sector. Or, for example, one of the biggest issues we have has got to do, and this goes back to Jackson's question, who should regulate? In various jurisdictions, governments have no power on Facebook or Twitter. So what Facebook is doing is now, I'm not saying, I mean, there's a lot to criticize about Facebook, but Facebook and Twitter are both trying to regulate themselves. So, for example, if I see news on China, Twitter now tells you this is official news of the government of China. Now, if you want to agree with the government of China, you are free to do so. If you don't want to, but at least you know where this is coming from. Is that the solution to everything? No. But efforts to have a sustainable balance on free speech have to come from governments, from civil society, and even from the private sector, especially when a lot of platforms are transnational. They are not national. So national law sometimes doesn't even apply.
And in fact, as you're saying, Facebook recently introduced something which came up for me. So I read an article from the news website, and I didn't share it to my friends, but it was really interesting. And I was scrolling on my newsfeed and I went to share it. It was the same article. I recognized the headline and the photo. And it told me something along the lines of, you didn't open this link.
Yes.
Are you sure you want to share it? It's like, okay, no, I did open the link, but just somewhere else, you know? And I think that's an amazing step forward.
Yes,
It's not just like
that's a
headline.
nudge. Sort, yes, that's
Exactly.
very positive.
That's quite good.
Yes.
These are definitely good directions to be going into. But I mean, I think freedom of speech, obviously, it's a much bigger topic than, I mean, journalism is center stage in this, but there's obviously civil society,
Yes.
There's also what can I say, and sort of to move it on a little bit. So how I don't know who wants to go first, but how do you see censorship as a mechanism or tool in freedom of speech? I mean, should anything go? Should we be censoring? And who should be censoring? Should it be the audience? Should it be the laws? So maybe Emma, maybe you'd like to.
Okay, I don't mind starting. So I remember very clearly in my first year of junior college. So I went to a private school. So going to junior college then was like this massive change, and I personally loved it. there's just so much more happening and all of that. And in my first year, I was sitting outside Blue Bar, having my coffee in the morning, and someone passed me a copy of In Realtà. And this was 2009. And I obviously went through it because who am I to turn down a free newspaper? And there was the story, that infamous story of Litkisser Sewi, of Alex Velagera. And I had passed it around to my friends, we had had a conversation about it. No one was inflamed by it. It was just, wow, this is a lot to be reading. Like, never read anything like this. And reading it in Maltese was even, it adds a layer of harshness to the language. And I remember then following the debates that ensued over the following days, and it was madness. You would think he was writing, honestly, like, okay, what he wrote was really heavy. But for me, it's so ironic that this disgusting male chauvinist that's depicted in this piece of fiction is somehow the subject of more ire than an actual male chauvinist doing horrible actual things to a real life person when, for example, something like rape is reported in the news. How do we go from, wow, this is terrible, don't talk about it, to, oui, amma x'kienet libsa? You know, like, how do we, as a society, I feel like we really thrive on sensationalism and then forget that sometimes there are real people behind actual stories. So we all had this like major scandal moment when that was published. I mean, obviously, eventually, thankfully, the courts threw out the case because I don't believe that it should not have been published. Perhaps more care could have been taken to ensure it didn't fall in the hands of kids. But if it was at uni, everyone's 18 or, 18 in 2 months. So it's fine. And junior college is an extension of that. It probably wasn't put there by them. It was probably some people who got it there. I don't know how it ended up in my hands. Anyway, but for example, then we had that play, there was Piazza Meat in it, Stitching, exactly, which was in the same year banned from being played. It eventually was shown in 2018 and I had gone to watch it and it was great. I mean, there was nothing, I don't know what the issue was, but apparently there was a lot of an issue with it. Then more recently with the carnival floats and the school and the Archbishop and all of that. And I mean, we did make some steps towards removing, for example, the vilification laws and all of this. That did happen. But if it was still changed, the artistic expression was still molded and changed to fit a narrative that apparently doesn't cause the Archbishop any discomfort. I'm not going into whether it should have or not, but isn't that censorship in a way? So I don't know if the laws are actually working in this regard. I don't know if we've done enough in this regard. And then even more recently, when COVID was happening, there was that time that the Broadcasting Authority advised PBS to not air the questions that were being asked to the public health superintendent. That's not on. I mean, the Institute of Journalists had come out all out against it, and then it happened a few months later again. Yeah. So the whole censorship thing, I think, has so many facets. It's not only artistic censorship that comes into play, it's everything, I mean, I feel like on this I could go on for ages, so for us I'll stop here. Michael.
Yes. No, practically I agree with everything you said, Emma. There's also an issue right now, for example, in Malta, it's not the case, but in Britain and in the USA, in universities, there's a whole controversy going on between different activists of the feminist movement on how gender should be defined. And for example, there was a huge controversy in the University of Sussex, where a feminist philosopher actually quit her job because other feminists were telling her that she is not being sensible to transgender people. Now, I'm not going into the merits of the case, but I'm just trying to show how, as you correctly said, the censorship issue is very broad. It's not only about art and culture. Well, basically, I don't agree with censorship. I mean, as long as there are safeguards, for example, as regards children. So if Stitching is deemed to be a play which adults can watch, then yes, let any adult watch. I don't want any minister or archbishop or whoever telling me I cannot watch it. I decide if I watch it or not. But this is again where regulation comes in. Regulation doesn't mean censorship, but you need to say this play is suitable for adults only, or for example, maybe for example, when there were the vilification laws discussed in Parliament in Malta a few years ago, I followed it quite closely, and there was a particular MP from the opposition who made a very important point. He wasn't saying let us not have these laws, but he was using the argument which sort of I used a few minutes ago on responsibility. If for example, in the name of free speech, you decide to offend a religion in such a way that this can have a societal backlash. There was the Charlie Hebdo issue in France. Yeah. Okay. Now, of course, my sympathy is towards the journalists who were the victims of all this. But if there is also an element of responsibility. So free speech is not an absolute. If there was a teacher in France a few years ago who I think was beheaded or something. He didn't say anything tabarra minnaw, as we say in Maltese. But for certain groups, what he said was unacceptable. Now, does this mean that we cannot say anything because some groups will get offended? It's very difficult to draw a line. But this is what I mean when I say that we have to invest more in education on responsibility. Some people, for example, don't know that when they offend people on Facebook, that what they write is traceable, for example. These basic skills. And again, the European Parliament some years ago had issued a very good template on this, on some basic skills, like the one you mentioned, Emma, on have you read this article? That's just a small nudge. But it helps. It makes you think twice, maybe, before you share something. And by responsibility, I mean equipping ourselves and each other to know how to debate. For example, we can agree to disagree, but there's no need to offend each other. One can be pro-abortion and one can be anti-abortion. Fair enough, but there's no need to tell, you were a victim of this yourself. So you know what I'm saying. So
I promise you, I know.
I mean, and you have all my solidarity. If someone disagrees with you, he can disagree with you, but there's no need to call you all these names and whatever. But my problem is that as I see it, that in certain areas, we mention this a lot, and it's fine, and I agree. I mean, I agree that when you were offended, that there was a societal show of solidarity towards you. Of course, I agree. But we have to, of course, not everyone, there were others who were against you, but you had a lot of sympathy from many people, even people who disagree with you on the issue. Yes. But what I'm trying to say is that in certain areas, for example, in party politics, we don't, so, sometimes you hear nationalisti mhux hekk, or laburisti mhux hekk. That is also very divisive, in my opinion. Because some people take things literally.
On this. Yes, I agree with you 100% on this, because in Malta, we are such a polarized country. What we say, for example, what you said about pro-choice and anti-choice, for me, that is so, it's so bad to see, okay, what happened, and yes, there was some public support, which was amazing, and I appreciate it tremendously. But there was also so much, because of the person it came from, a lot of people thought that it was okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, I've been offended countless times on Facebook, obviously, as anyone has who's ever said anything publicly, really. But that one struck a chord, not because it was particularly disgusting, because, I mean, it was, but like, Halia. But because of the standing of which that person holds. So I feel like the example that needs to be set there comes to a higher standard, like with politicians and corruption, for example. Politicians should be held to a higher standard. The same as how people in positions of power should be held to a higher standard when it comes to debate. How do we know?
For example, shouldn't we, I agree 100% with you, but shouldn't we know, for example, who is funding a particular newspaper? Don't we have the right to know who is funding an advertorial? When you have a politician on the front page of a magazine and people think that it's an innocent advert, but actually thousands of pounds would have been spent much of which are in clear violation of our electoral laws. Well, they're not actually breaking the law. I mean, I know how this works. I was in it, and you know too, because you're in it yourself now. But our electoral laws, in a way, encourage politicians to be dishonest, because our electoral law tells you you only have to declare your expenditure in the last 4 weeks or whatever. If you spent much more money in the previous year for your electoral campaign, you're not breaking the law, but you're not following the spirit of the law. Now,
No, but
so
again,
what am I trying to say? Just as we should hold priests, politicians, and public figures to a high, to standards, as you mentioned, I think that has to be across the board. However, I have a right to know if what I am reading is actually a researched article or whether it is funded by somebody. Sometimes you have it written down. Sometimes you have it. This is an advert. When I say that, I give it much more respect. Then when I see some, let me take it to the party political stations issue. I probably everyone is going to disagree with me here. I think that, there's a lot to criticize on Net TV and Super One. There's a lot and a lot to criticize, okay? But in a way, they are more transparent than some others who do not tell you that they are receiving sponsorships, for example, for writing certain things. At least, it's from Labour or PN. You get what, if you want to follow it, follow it. If you don't want to follow it, don't. I like listening to both, for example.
They wear their bias on their sleeve, tipo. So you're aware, at least when you're going to one, it's going to be Labour leaning and anti-PN. When you're going to Net, it's exactly the opposite. We know this. Jek tarom it-tnejn, forsi kollok idea ta' x'inhu jiġri. But the thing is then, when, for example, like what you mentioned about our laws encourage us to be dishonest, I think what the problem is here, what we really need to bear down on, I'm not sure what the expression is. We need to understand why our electorate wants us to be dishonest. So let me come to what I'm saying. Me being a pro-choice candidate, everyone told me, oh my God, you're so naive. Just say you're not pro-choice, just shut your mouth. Ma, why are you so open about these things? Okay, but I'm asking people to elect me to the highest organ in the land, tipo, that can make laws that determine how we live. So do you really want me to pretend I'm something that I'm not? And then it comes into play, the electorate, not all of them naturally, react so violently to an opinion, this polarization, which makes someone want to not be honest about themselves. There have been days, I'll be completely upfront, that the hate has gotten so bad that I could barely get myself out of bed. It was so vile and constant, and a constant barrage of so much, and sometimes by the same people, of course, because they have an axe to grind, but the misinformation, the complete character assassination. So it makes me think, maybe those people were right. Maybe I'm the idiot here for not pretending I'm someone else. So we need to educate people, I think, on a way that doesn't make someone think, okay, dik favor diskussjoni for, l-għażla. And instead say people that she's not fit to be in parliament. And instead be like, okay, Mela, I don't agree with her on this. But what about the other things she stands for? Is that something valid? Do I care about those? Of course you don't, memx tagħmel, it could be that as well. But we need to learn how to differentiate between points of view, how to debate. And I think this is something that's always been missing. When I was young, I went through the education system here. The first time I ever had a debate was in a marketing lesson when we had to defend the choices we made in marketing a product at A-level. And I was 17. So it's pretty sad that 17 years of education didn't teach me a single thing about how to debate. And on a positive note in this regard, some years ago, a subject called ethics was introduced in schools. Now, I am a parent myself, and my son chose ethics. My son goes to a government school. And there they are actually, and it's great, they are encouraged to debate. But the problem, the ethics is only chosen mostly by foreigners, or else those who do not want to choose religion. Whereas I have nothing against religion. I'm not anti-clerical. I'm very liberal, but I'm not anti-clerical. But I believe everyone should learn ethics, because
you learn important skills. How to you
100%.
learn how to debate with different views, with different points of view.
So I don't want to cut the discussion.
Yeah, sorry.
But the MHA actually had something to do with the introduction of that course. But anyway, that's a different topic. And so I just want to bring it to a fore before we go to the questions on Facebook, because I can see that there's a lot going on there. So maybe just in a very short way, maybe Michael, you want to start. So what do you think needs, I mean, in your view, what in the local context, what do we need to do? What safeguards do we need to put in place over the next few years? What needs to happen in your opinion?
Okay. I'm not one who likes to give, a 100% answer, because there never is, in my opinion. What I believe that we should do is have a process of proper deliberation, which includes parliament, parties which are not in parliament, civil society representatives, experts in the various fields, and other stakeholders to debate on this issue. Now, we had a golden opportunity to do this 2 years ago on the constitutional reforms. And unfortunately, it was a rushed job, and it was really a missed opportunity. And there we can discuss how we can combine rights with responsibilities. That's from a political perspective. I don't believe that I should come up with 100 solutions. I mean, others like doing that, but I don't like doing it myself. I believe in the process, in the democratic process, which should be inclusive, however, not just two parties and so forth. But in the longer term, from a more long-term point of view, I think we need to invest more in these subjects like ethics, and also in lifelong learning for adults who might know how to use Facebook, for example, but do not know how to decipher whether, and this, I'm not referring to illiterate adults. I know people who are highly qualified and they get news about COVID and they don't know whether it's true or false. So we need to invest more from a longer term perspective. I think we need to invest more in education like ethics, lifelong learning, and so forth. But the key words for me, and I'll stop here, are that rights come with responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But I am against censorship. So responsibilities doesn't mean that you shut people up or you blow them up or you send them to jail or whatever. But if I have the freedom to speak, I should be aware that my freedom can impinge on your freedom. It is relational, it is contextual, and there are some laws which are not in place and some laws which need to improve. For example, what Emma said earlier on libel, maybe the laws are there, yes, but as we were saying, maybe they need to be made a bit more, efficient or equitable. Because again, not everyone, if I offend you, but you do not have, you cannot afford a lawyer, for example. Some people are in these situations sometimes, not only on censorship and on free speech, but on other issues as well. So sometimes we have laws which are actually in place, but which need to be operationalized in a better way.
I agree with a lot of what Michael said, and I really think so. When you mentioned ethics, I have a little brother, he's 12, and I sometimes do homework with him when I'm babysitting. Well, boy sitting, I'm not allowed to call it babysitting. And his ethics homework is always the most fun. Like it's honestly just debate and really, really cool things. But he has ethics because my mom and her partner chose ethics instead of religion. Yes. And for me, it is insane that ethics is a choice. It should be completely part of the curriculum. Perhaps linked up with media literacy. So there could be a separate subject that teaches people how to do adult things that they are going to have to do. So that's something very positive, but it does need to be improved upon. Then I think the main issue is that we have this right to freedom of expression, right? And the population have not been taught their rights. So from an educational perspective, we like to say, oh my God, we have such a high turnout, highest voter turnout in Europe, for example, in our elections. But then so many of the people voting don't understand their rights, their obligations, what it means to vote. Do you vote from top to bottom of the party you like? What happens if you cross vote? What happens if you vote for one person? There are people who do not understand how our voting system works. Many people. And I get it because it's impossible to understand. It took me a long, long time to understand it. This is no critique of anyone, but it does need to be understood.
Yes.
So, and I'm genuinely not suggesting everyone takes a copy of the Constitution to bed with them and, you know, has a cute midnight read before their sleep, but it wouldn't be a bad idea either. But if we're ever going to live, it wouldn't, honestly, if we're ever going to live in a society that values these rights and these obligations, and the people who need to promulgate them need to know what they are. How can we be expecting our citizens to respect freedom of expression when they haven't been taught where the line is? So I don't know, that's one point. And then there's the point of SLAP laws. So SLAPs are strategic lawsuits against public participation. And this is a huge problem in Malta. So this links again into the judicial system, the efficacy of it, the efficiency, and how it's used as a negative way to censor journalists and active members of society. So at the moment, I know that the resolution put forward by Roberta Metsola at the European Parliament went through a couple of weeks back, if I'm not mistaken, which is great. So they're going to start working on that. But in the interim, I mean, okay, any EU law will take a while to be drafted. In the interim, we need a domestic legislation on this front. I mean, we need to be protecting our journalists on this front. And I think, I mean, you know, I think everyone just needs to be a bit more empathetic, a bit more tolerant, and perhaps, you know, I don't know, take the Constitution to bed with them. It's just a suggestion. I'll stop there.
Okay, so thank you both. That was a very interesting discussion. So at this point, we're going to bring in some comments from Facebook Live. And Gary De Warner here with us, also from the MHA, is going to give us a quick summary of some of the discussion points that's been going on. So Gary, take it away.
Hi, first of all, thank you both for a very interesting discussion. Please bear with me because there are a few comments on several sources, so I need to make sure I read everyone's out. Some are comments, some are questions. So Anne says that the reason media views and opinions on sexual cases, especially domestic violence and rape, appear offensive to some is because these cases are dealt with very poorly by the courts. Inadequate sentences is commonplace in Maltese courts. This in turn provokes individual and media outrage that can appear offensive. On the same lines, Tula said, I agree that people should be free to criticize court decisions, but perhaps better not pass judgments before the case is settled. Aaron said, I say that the word hate is much more than belittling someone with a different political view than yours, or someone calling you names or whatever. One thing is offending someone, another thing is hating someone. Hate is deep and evil. A free, offensive and vulgar comment is not hate. It's just a vulgar person blabbering without thinking and without behaving decently. To me, for an offense to classify as hate, it has to be targeted, repeated, orchestrated, and with an end agenda. He then went on to give another comment. I cannot see how regulating the profession of journalism he's talking about here can be problematic. On what way can it be problematic? On the other hand, a warranted journalist can still write unethically and without backing claims with research, especially if the article generates leads and says what people want to listen. Ultimately, without enforcement, warrants are pretty much useless. It's not that we hear too often of architects and lawyers losing their warrants, and I am confident that it's not because all of them behave professionally. Another comment by Aaron was that the problem with One and Net is that the news and journalists are not reliable, and in this case, yes, they do instill hate in the masses that decide to follow them. Now, on another source, we have this one is specifically for Emma. By Robert, not everyone who is on Facebook is equipped to note that you are not an expert on whatever you are writing, and that you are an expert of law only, most especially if you share fake news that looks legitimate. Juliana said, Emma, you say you saw so much fake news about COVID online, but COVID fake news is easy to spot if you have a bit of education. What about fake news about prominent people? You have no way of knowing that someone is lying about someone else, especially if the liar is a famous person with a lot of following and who others think is an ethical broadcaster. Joe said, you are right about the Maltese being sensationalist, and this is what is driving so much hate speech and news that is shared without it being verified, because it's sensationalist. And because the poster is not checked unless you open a libel case against them. The damage has been done and the sensationalism shared by the time you go to court. Cara said, my problem is with the fact that someone who calls for an MEP to be burned down is very rightly imprisoned for it. But someone who calls for someone less public to be bludgeoned to death gets out with a fine. And lastly, Julian said, I think that the key is with educating the people. Until we teach people to think critically, we will remain vulnerable as a nation. Thank you.
Can I just reply to the one I'm remembering? So there's a lot of information to take in. I think it was Aaron who said something about hate speech not just being insults. I think hate speech isn't, this is a very important point. Hate speech as defined by the law is defined by the law. It's not something that I feel is hateful or someone else might feel is hateful. This is literally defined in our law, so that it's not a subjective opinion. It is what it is. It's in our law. Now, whether we think we have a debate to have on broadening what was in the law, like Michael suggested about politicians, for example, that's another aspect of it. But hate speech is not, wow, you're so mean, or, you know, I don't like your argument, or shut up, ma, how annoying. That's not hate speech. You know, hate speech is, you're a murderer, or you should die, or you should be bludgeoned to death, as that other comment said. And on that other comment, I mean, yes, the punishments should be equal across the board. Another comment that I would like to reply to is that the issue, I think it was also Aaron actually, the issue that could be had with warrants is that warrants are handed out by the government. Now, journalists need to keep our government in check. How does a journalist keep our government in check and criticize, naturally, the government, whoever the government is of the day, if their being accredited to be a journalist comes solely from the government? So that's the issue I have with, and that's an issue a lot of journalists would have with it. I mean, we've seen how certain people in power treat journalists. So how is this not a legitimate fear to have? You know, like those are my replies that I remembered, to be honest.
I think that is a legitimate.
I think it's back. I think it's just not, of course. Say something. I mean, on this point, there are some countries where this is regulated by independent of the government.
My video is being a bit weird. I don't know if you can hear me anymore.
Oh, I can hear you. Everything is fine.
Okay, I missed what you both said about it, so I can't reply to you. I totally missed it. My internet connection was unstable according to Zoom. Sorry.
Mike was just having a bit of problems with the audio. No, I was just mentioning that in some jurisdictions, journalism is regulated, but it's regulated independent of the government. But obviously, you need an independent body and a large enough independent body.
And not only that, even when you have that independent body, then it comes down to how do you define a journalist? Is it someone with a degree in journalism? Is it someone who's been doing it for 5 years? What about journalists who've been around and have been journalists for such a long time, but never went to uni for it? Do they get automatically excluded? So there are a lot of caveats to this, and it's important that we recognize them. I'm not saying it's completely undoable, but it is problematic and can be problematic and should be treated as such.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, I think what we're getting at is that the solution to this is more education. It's reforms in education.
I honestly feel like education is the crux of the entire issue. It's not a jab at teachers. Teachers have been underfunded, undersupported for years now. So this isn't a them problem. It's the fact that we have such a rigid syllabus that so much of the time kids are expected to not ask questions like why, or expected to just parrot repeat. I think we might have lost Michael.
He's refreshing.
Okay. That's a big problem. But for example, the ethics thing is a step in the right direction. And again, I'm sure there are teachers that love when their kids ask why, you know, in class. Just it needs to be ingrained in the way the syllabus is drafted. So it can't just be, for example, an exam cannot just be reeling off quotes from a poem. You know, that isn't how people learn. That isn't thinking critically about, even though it's called crit, you know, like it's more than that. And I think we need to do more in this regard. And I think we can be doing more in this regard. And I think a step in this direction would be to ensure that teachers are paid adequately and that the profession becomes something that people, you know, have a good feeling towards, where they can rise up, where, you know, that gives them joy in their job.
I'm back.
Hi.
Sorry for that. I don't know.
No problem. Do you want to give your closing remarks?
Yes, I agree with practically all comments which the viewer said, and as regard Emma said, yes, the journalists are wary of the fact that government can control, and I agree with you, but you can say that for every profession. I mean, volunteer organizations are regulated by the state as well, and volunteer organizations, some, not all of them, but some of them are actually meant to be critical towards the state on certain issues. There could be ways and means how to make the process as open as possible. For example, not giving a minister a monopoly over a decision, but having a proper board which is as open as possible and so forth, just as you have with some other professions. I'm not saying let's make the media shut up, definitely not. But I am saying that as a reader, I have the right to know whether what I am reading is coming from a journalist or from someone who is paid to write that, or whether some things you can never know. For example, a lot of campaigns which take place behind the scenes, but at least I have the right to know. Now, if I can disagree with the journalist, I can agree. And I'm not saying that journalists are the only people who should give news. I'm not a journalist, but I write in the Malta Independent. But when I write in the Malta Independent, I say I am a sociologist. I'm writing as a sociologist. The problem is when you have someone who isn't a journalist or who isn't an economist or who isn't a medical doctor and says he is. And we do have examples of that. And as somebody said earlier on, and I really agree, and I know real cases in this regard, there have been many cases across the board of someone saying something against someone publicly on a newspaper, on a TV show, on a blog or whatever. And the other person's life or family is ruined because of an allegation. Yes. And that is very, very harmful. I mean, there needs to be, it cannot be a free-for-all where everyone says whatever he likes. But education does play a very important role. I believe that the ethics subject, I don't think it's going to solve everything, but it really is a step forward. For example, my son is in a classroom where all the other students are, there are only 3 students in class. There's him who is a male and 2 females from different countries and different cultures. And the other time, during Parents' Day, the teacher told me what a lot of dialogue takes place. And that is great. These are things which we need to learn. Very many of us, unfortunately, are not socialized to learn to appreciate other cultures, and other cultures could also be political cultures. I still find this very problematic, that we dismiss someone because he is nationalist or because he is Labourite. Maybe someone from Labour says something which I agree with, or the other way around, you know? So I think that is very important. I think what the reader, what the viewer said reflects the realities of many people. Let us keep in mind that many of us here, myself included, are in our own echo chambers, in our own bubbles, and very often we are detached from certain realities. Now, you mentioned Emma earlier on, and I think that was a very important comment. Voters. Now, I don't know what you're doing for your electoral campaign, but I would imagine that you are meeting a lot, and something which I saw, for example, during the MEP campaign, is that there are so many different perspectives out there, many of which I disagree with, for example, and I would not be ready to sell myself for that perspective. So I agree totally with you. But if anything, the political experience teaches you that there are a lot of voices, not all of which are represented in the media. The media is very important, But society isn't only the media, for better or for worse. Because, for example, there are many people who are against corruption. There are some voters who would vote for you only if you are corrupt, for example. No, that is not acceptable. That is not, but it exists.
Everything exists here. I mean, if you can think it's
so we have to acknowledge these things, but we need to really equip. For when you mentioned the electoral law, I agree with you. There are so many people, including people with doctorates and who don't know how the electoral law works. It's so complicated. Now, I honestly believe that many politicians, and I would say from both sides, actually want the electoral law to remain as it is. Not the law. They don't want that a lot of information is distributed. Because, for example, if more people...
That's exactly the problem.
Yes, if more people know that you can cross-party vote, for example, and many people do not know that you can cross-party vote, that can open possibilities for smaller parties. So here the big parties paradoxically agree. Now, I'm not saying they met each other and there's some conspiracy, but if you are a big party politician and you want to get elected by inheriting votes from your own party, it's not in your interest that people know that they can cross-vote. Now, some politicians are ethical, and there are ethical politicians on both sides who explain how the electoral system works. And probably because they are honest, they end up not being elected. Now, I'm not saying that whoever is elected is dishonest, okay? But it's very easy in politics, very easy to be dishonest, to hide certain information, for example, to do a house visit and tell somebody that if she cross votes, her vote becomes invalid, and to gain from that instance. That is very unfortunate. So education is a very powerful tool. It's a slow tool. It takes time, but it is very, very powerful. I mean, after all, it is thanks to education and activism that today we are discussing certain issues, including issues which Emma holds to her heart, which if you discuss them 20 years ago, it would be as if you are the Antichrist or something like that. Education and civil society activism have really, really helped. I remember, and I'll close here because I've spoken too much. In sociology, I remember the first time when I mentioned same-sex couples, which was about 20 years ago or a bit less, as a lecturer, that is. Many students thought I was saying something obscene, it was really something. Today, when you mention LGBTIQ issues, at least at a university, at a tertiary educational level, it's seen as something mainstream. So things can change, even laws can change. And here, of course, journalists have a huge role to play. So does civil society, and so do educators, teachers, lifelong teachers, lecturers, and so forth.
Agreed. Honestly, yes, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I think everyone really needs to do their part and pull the same rope and make sure that the electorate is as educated as possible, not only on the way our democracy works, but that's a fundamental here, yes, but on everything, on every aspect of what their rights are, what they need to do to protect those rights, the recourse that they can have.
Yes.
What their obligations and their duties are in the protection of those rights towards other people. Yes. Honestly, the list goes on, and I feel like we could have this debate till tomorrow.
For example, a positive initiative which I noticed very recently, I think the Daphne Foundation launched it. I'm not sure, but there's this initiative which assists people who have a legal issue and they need to go to court and they don't know exactly what their rights are. This is very important.
It's the Public Interest Litigation Network.
Yes.
Yes. By the Daphne Foundation. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That is something which comes from civil society, but so it doesn't come from the government, whoever the government is, it comes from civil society, but it helps equip people to know their rights and their responsibilities.
Yes. I hope we have more initiatives like that one.
Yeah.
So we had a very interesting discussion, very detailed discussion, and I want to thank both of you. This was a super event. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. And also, I'd like to thank the audience. And please, I'd like this, if we can, this discussion would be great to continue on Facebook, in the comments section. And beyond that, So I'm going to go to a close. Again, thank you both for being here and thanks for joining us to the audience.
Thank you and well done.
Thank you.
Thanks.